And this started to unravel really with the Hindenburg report. So Hindenburg Research came out with a report that had a lot of allegations against Adani, ranging from accounting irregularities through to stock market manipulation, through to borrowing using their own shares as collateral, in addition to just rampant nepotism. So when we put all of these allegations together, fraud through to market manipulation, through to other allegations of illegality, we basically saw investor confidence being shaken in Adani, and hence its stock price dropping nearly 50% at one point. And this is something that Adani is really going to struggle with to try to regain market confidence.
Who are Hindenburg Research? Tell us more about what they do and how such companies make their profit.
Well, Hindenburg Research is one of the categories of activist investor. So basically what they do is they identify companies, usually bad actors, so companies that might have frauds or potential frauds or just general bad practices. Then they go and make an investment position, a position that will benefit if that company goes under, so the stock price declines or the bonds default or something like that happens. Then they publish a report that goes through all of the negative allegations they have. So in the case of Adani, what Hindenburg Research did is they identified Adani first, and then they took out a trade. In this case, it seemed to be trades in Adani's bonds, so that is the debt that Adani had issued. And then they published this report, which went through all of those allegations in significant detail. This report was reportedly the culmination of 2 years of forensic work. So it certainly was not a quick enterprise to undertake, but they definitely did quite a bit of work to try to generate, in this case, some profit. And Hindenburg's ultimate motivation really is to make profits. They're going to make a profit from the stock price declining and or Hindenburg's bonds defaulting, because that's effectively what they need to do to keep operating, and that's how they generally function.
And what are the legal and ethical issues surrounding this?
Well, there's probably two categories of things to talk about here. We've got the legal issues and the ethical issues, and they are a little bit intertwined, but they're separate. So in the terms of the legal issues, there are probably two overarching ones that Hindenburg really needs to consider. Firstly, you've got market manipulation. That is, if Hindenburg were to publish false and misleading information, which then affects the stock price, that would be market manipulation. And that would be illegal in the United States, which is where Hindenburg is based and where they're trading, but also in Australia. And this would be relatively easy to discover because people would realize after a while that Hindenburg had put out false information if that were to be the case. The second legal issue is insider trading. So say Hindenburg were to go out and do really deep digging into accounting statements of private companies, and various other pieces of non-public information. That is information that no reasonable investor could have any prospect of ever getting their hands on. This would be inside information. And then if Hindenburg were to trade on that inside information, that would also potentially be illegal, depending on the exact nature of what they have dug up and how they're doing the trading. So those are the legal issues. At the moment, we don't see any allegations that Hindenburg has actually done any of that illegal work, but of course Adani is alleging the report was false. Then you've got the ethical issues. When we're thinking about the ethical issues, we really need to consider a few factors. First, is it a net positive that Hindenburg has come out and told us about all of this fraud that is potentially going on, assuming the report is actually true and can be held up? Second, would Hindenburg have done this if there were not a financial incentive? And in addition to that, relatedly, would that financial incentive impugn what Hindenburg is doing in terms of their research? And then thirdly, is Hindenburg harming any innocent party? So if Hindenburg is making money by revealing fraud, which is something we want to know about, and is not really harming innocent third parties, then there isn't really that much of an ethical conflict, as unseemly as it might ultimately seem, for Hindenburg to be profiting from a corporate decline.
You explained that so well, Mark, for something that's so complex. Of course, Adani has vehemently denied the allegations of fraud, issuing a more than 400-page rebuttal and calling the report a calculated attack on India.
That is absolutely right. So if we look at Adani's response, the response is, like you said, very, very long. And it does call to mind an old practice in law, where you used to engage in discovery, and in the discovery process, you would give the opposing party everything, which would include relevant fluff that would just force them to sift through, waste their time and waste their resources. So if we're looking at what Adani did, they put out this nearly 400-page response. A lot of the response had fluff in it related to ESG and other things that they purportedly do. Now, this obviously raises a tangential concern, which is what happened with FTX, which is where FTX engaged in a lot of ESG practices to try to throw people off the trail. If they can look like they're doing good, then people might not dig too deeply. And that to some extent seems to be what's going on in the response document. There were also just obfuscations in there, so things such as describing Hindenburg's report as an attack on India, so some jingoistic terms. And then, interestingly, in the response document, Adani also actually acknowledged that there were actually reports of fraud, and there were various legal cases involving fraud that had gone forward. So to some extent, they actually accepted and acknowledged what Hindenburg put up. In the 400-page report, there wasn't a ton that actually really answered Hindenburg's allegations, which is why we're still seeing the stock price go down so considerably, and why their bonds, that is their debt, are being treated as distressed debt in the United States at the moment.
So what happens next then?
Yeah, so in terms of what happens next, Adani is going to need to try to resist Hindenburg's report in some way. The best way for them to do this would be to actually come up with an independent third party that could produce something vaguely credible, rather than the response document they came up with, which was not terribly convincing, as we've seen from the market's reaction. Now, clearly Adani doesn't seem like they're going to do this, and that could be tricky, because if they have indeed been using shell companies to go out and buy Adani stock to prop up the share price so that Adani could then borrow against those highly inflated shares, that is going to be very difficult for a third party to just dismiss and sweep under the rug. That would be the best case scenario for Adani. Otherwise, Adani might try to muddle along and hope that people just forget about this. Hope that maybe their conduct is not so illegal in India, or a lot of the actions were not actually done in India and therefore weren't violating India's securities law, or couldn't be pursued against those companies if they're based overseas. So they could try that tact of basically a jurisdictional tact, which I suspect they might do since some of these shell companies were in Mauritius, so potentially out of the jurisdictional reach of India, for example, or at least outside of the ability for India to pursue those companies. That could be another step forward. But at the moment, Adani doesn't seem to have a good response to any of this. If we look at the share offering they were trying to do, Adani was going to offer shares and issue those, which would have been super useful because they would have got the cash in, paid off some debt, and then maybe their bonds wouldn't have been quite as distressed as they ultimately have become. However, that has now been shelved, likely because the share price declined so much, and also because if they issued shares, amidst allegations of market manipulation, then Adani themselves could potentially be sued by the investors who had bought those shares. So Adani is really in a tricky position. It seems like at the moment, they're just kind of in a holding period, perhaps waiting for it to blow over, which doesn't seem like it's going to happen. They have, however, threatened legal action against Hindenburg. That doesn't seem likely to succeed if Hindenburg's report is actually truthful and correct, because Hindenburg is very unlikely to be able to be sued for just publishing correct information. So we'll see whether they succeed at court with that anyway.
So much to discuss here, Mark, but I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for explaining that to us so well. Mark Humphery-Jenner, thank you.
Thank you. Great being with you.